Hey, what's up guys? My name is Element, and today I'm going to be showing you my guide to team building in Riot's new game, Teamfight Tactics. My guide is broken down into 4 main sections, those sections being RNG, synergies, items, and adaptability. The first section that I want to look at is RNG. On your screen now you should see 2 tables breaking down the probabilities of getting a unit at each player level of the game. For example, you can see that at level 1 and 2, you can only get tier 1 units, whereas you can't get a tier 5 unit until level 6 at the earliest. Now, if you look at the second table, what you can see is I've taken the probabilities from the first table and then divided it by the number of units in each tier and then multiplied by 5 because you can draw 5 units at a time per refresh or per round. These probabilities in the second table reflect the probability of getting the unit you want at that level, respectively. For example, I have a 45.45% chance to get a Tristana in at least one of the 5 options at level 1 and level 2 for my player. Why I'm showing you this is to break down how likely it is to you in numbers of getting all the champions that you want and getting them multiple times to get them to 3 stars, because 3-star champions are way better than 1-star champions. So for example, if you look over at the tier 5 section and you take Misfortune for example, you have to roll an 8.3% chance 9 times if you were trying to get a Misfortune to tier 3, which is just extremely unlikely. So when you're focusing on building a team comp and you're trying to theory craft what you think your best comp possible is, you have to take into consideration the fact that you're not going to be 3-starring any of the tier 5 champions realistically, and you'd be lucky to 2-star them. Additionally, another factor you want to consider is at what levels are you playing the majority of the game. So even though the table looks crazy for the probabilities early and late in terms of how high the tier 5% chance is late compared to early, how high the tier 1 chance is, the majority of your game is going to be played between levels 5 and 8. So you want to look at those probabilities mainly as to what you're building your team from. The goal of these tables is to show you how unlikely it is that you're going to be 3-starring a tier 4 or tier 5 unit compared to a tier 1, 2, or 3 unit, and to show you that you want to have a lot of focus around your lower tier units even though they're less cool than the higher tier units, because they're going to be the bulk of your comp. Moving on, we look at synergies. In Teamfight Tactics, every champion has at least one origin and class that they are a part of. These origins and classes offer bonuses for having the right number of champions from each respective origin or class. An example of an origin buff is the dragon buff, which gives dragons immunity, or the noble buff, which gives armor and healing. An example of class buffs are elementalist and ranger. The elementalist buff spawns an elemental, which is pretty much just Daisy from the champion Ivern at the start of each round, and the ranger buff gives attack speed to rangers. The reason why I've chosen the respective buffs from the origins and classes is to show you the synergies as well as to focus in on the likelihoods of each buff. For the dragon buff, although it only requires 2 units, there's also only 2 options, and those 2 options are higher tier champions, being the 3-cost Shyvana and the 4-cost Aurelion Soul, whereas the noble buff has 6 options and it can involve 3 1-cost units, so it's much easier to achieve. And the same goes over for elementalist and ranger. For the ranger buff, you can get Vayne and Varus, which are both very easy to get, whereas in the elementalist buff it requires 3 units and there's only 4 possible options, with one of them being a Nivea, which is a tier 5 unit, so it is much more unlikely to get a Nivea, which pigeonholes you into having to get the 3 other units. This makes it so that it's much harder for you to get the elementalist buff, and is why I generally stay away from it unless it's presented to me. But I find it that it's really hard to go into a game saying, hey, I'm going to go for an elementalist comp, because RNG can be against you. Moving on from which buffs are harder and easier to get, I want to talk about overlap of champions. So for example, if you have Braum, Ashe, Leona, Vayne, and Garen, This gets you the Glacial, Noble, Ranger, and Guardian buffs. So with 5 units, you can have 4 buffs. This is something that you want to think of when you're building your comp to maximize the amount of buffs you can have, because buffs are really strong in this game, and having a comp with 0 buffs versus a comp with 4 buffs can make a world of difference when you're fighting. Moving on, I want to look at items. Items are a huge part of Teamfight Tactics, and they can make or break a lot of champions. For example, Aurelion Soul with no items is nothing to worry about, but when you have Aurelion Soul with 2 Spear Sojins and a Rage Blade, for example, he's going to tear your team apart. So the item RNG at the beginning of the game allows you to have 1 to 5 items before the first PvP fight, and is going to be the basis of what your team comp is built off item wise. If after the first round of items you don't have a single tier or BF sword, it's probably going to be really hard for you to make an Aurelion Soul comp, considering you don't have either of the 2 components needed for Spear Sojin, which is what Aurelion Soul relies on. Whereas let's say I got 2 bows and a needlessly large rod off of the first item set, I'm probably going to want to go for some sort of an 80 carry central comp, because I already have 2 possible items that I can make in the rapid fire cannon or the Ginsu's Rage Blade. Both of these items are really strong for 80 carries, so it's going to be more effective for me to put them onto that rather than try and make them work into the Aurelion Soul comp, where you don't exactly want those items, you want more of the tier focused items. What this is trying to demonstrate is that items being such a big part of the game are going to force you to have to go into certain team comps whether you want to or not to be most effective. I can't just go into every game trying to build Aurelion Soul with double Sojin, because some games I just won't get a single tier or I won't get a single BF sword, and then I can't build that. You're going to have to look at the items you have and think of your possibilities of what you can make with those items and decide your comp going forward from there. The final section that I want to look at is adaptability, and this section is a lot of focus on thinking. So let's take a scenario of I'm going for a comp that has a lot of focus on tier 1 and tier 2 champions. If it's after level 5, let's say, it's going to be a lot harder for me to complete my tier 1 and tier 2 champions. So at that point, if I only have 1 level 2 Tristana, then I might want to be like, hey, I'm probably not going to get a tier 3 Tristana. I might as well give up on it now and shift my focus into some tier 3 champions, for example, because their probabilities are high right now, and it's more likely that I'll be able to make one of them a 3-star than it is that I'm going to be able to make my Tristana a 3-star. Another thing that you want to think about is low tier comps are easier to complete if you don't spend money on leveling, because you have more money to spend on rerolls, as well as you're going to stay at a lower level for longer. The only caveat to one of these strategies is that you are going to be a lower level, so you'll have less champions. So you have to think about whether having a tier 3 Vayne is better than having a tier 2 Vayne and a tier 2 another champion, for example. As well as you want to have multiple options in all games. A big thing that people have to think about is I'm not going to get the comp I want every single game. So when I'm building a comp, I want to have multiple options. Say Kennen's my focus. Kennen's a Yordle, a Ninja, and an Elementalist. So Kennen is a strong unit just by nature because you have 3 options to go through. The same applies for Gnar, because Gnar is under Wild, Yordle, and Shapeshifter. So these are good champions that you're able to fit into multiple comps, whereas something like a Blitzcrank is only a robot and a brawler. And he's alone in the robot every time you play him. He really only has 1 possible bonus, because no matter what, if you have him, he's going to get the robot bonus. Another thing you want to think about in terms of having options is also your item options. If you have a champion that only works with 1 item, then you may want to focus away from that champion, because you're either going to make or break off of 1 item. Whereas if I can put multiple items on a champion and it still performs close to optimal, it's a lot better than a champion that can only perform well with that one item, and it's just dog shit without that item. Another thing you want to think about is how many units you want to have in your main comp. For example, a comp that only has 5 units doesn't require a lot of money to be spent into leveling to get to higher level to have more units able to be played. Whereas a comp that's built off 7 or 8 units requires you to spend a lot of your money into leveling your actual player, which means that you can get less tier 3 champions because you can't buy them as often or re-roll for them as often. To recap, the main considerations when team building on Teamfight Tactics is how likely it is to get the champions that you want, to maximize the potential amount of buffs that you can have through synergies of origins and classes, and to have multiple item and unit options so that you don't pigeonhole yourself into a one-trick comp that only works if you get exactly what you want. That's going to be all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe, as well as please give me any and all feedback that you may have. It's the first guide I've ever made, so I'm open to all feedback and look to improve. Thanks.